Hey, welcome everyone. Um, we're going to talk about how to speed up hiring today. I'm here with
Gene.
Joel. Joel Jean. It's good that we're on the first name basis, so I don't make this mistake normally. He's with Swift Solar. You want to talk briefly about what Swift is?
Yeah, sure. Swift Solar is a Series A startup. We're developing a high efficiency solar technology. So trying to unlock the full potential of solar energy using next generation materials in new semiconductors.
It means solar panels that are very lightweight, very high efficiency, flexible, and can be a lot cheaper at scale. I'm a Swiftie. I love Swift Solar. Big fan of the company. Um, but as any company, or as any startup, they're growing. They need to hire, and the question was, how do you speed up hiring speeds? Um, First thing that comes to mind is work with a good recruiter. Um, Typically, at startups at a certain size, you don't have internal recruiting yet, so then you use outside firms. Then you start having kind of your head of people or your head of talent who can help you. Then you start getting individual recruiters for executive recruiting. So when you get to a bigger scale, you start again with external recruiters, and they're typically specialized. Like they're only hiring for CEOs or CFOs or stuff like that. And they kind of know the market, and they have everyone takes their phone calls because they know who to reach out to. So they'll only call people if it's relevant. And these people are super useful if you're doing exec recruiting. They can tell you, hey, they don't just know the resume, they know like kind of this happened, that happened. They typically place the people you're looking at, like they place them 7 years somewhere else. So they kind of know, they know a lot about the people. So the screening is easier. The people take their phone calls, especially if you're in a confidential search. It's super helpful because they kind of candidates take their word for it, and they only disclose the name of the company later down the line. Um, Typically with the recruiters, I try to do a weekly call. You walk through, okay, what happened? We talk to these people, anything we can learn, anything we can screen on earlier, either in the resume or in the questions they ask them. You say like, okay, here's the people we're looking at. What do you think? Um, and then not all of them might be ready yet. Um, I I find that I prefer to take. There's always kind of a balance. Like, which calls do you name? Do you take? How do you balance your own time, the quality of the candidates, the willingness of the candidates? I've always said I only want to talk to people who are 100% capable of the job, even if there's a 1% chance they're interested in the role. Just try to you just try to get in front of people, and then you try to sell the company without sounding like you're selling, like any good sales page. Which of course every interview is selling. It's also asking. Um, Good kind of scan up front saves a ton of time. Um, because for two reasons. First of all, it's a lot of time on your end to do one or two interviews with someone and then decline them. It's also a waste of time on their end. It hurts the reputation of the company to decline someone. No one likes getting declined. Everyone has an ego. Um, Also, if you're in process with people, there's less pressure to kind of really go digging for new candidates. So I tend to try to put the bar for like who to talk to pretty high up front.
Mm.
After a while, you kind of get an idea of what to look for in resumes. Not no earth-shattering news here, but longevity in the role is typically very important.
Yeah. Yeah. So maybe I can jump in. I think there's a lot of good input there. I'm curious. I think for us specifically, the challenge has been balancing getting input from a broad enough cross section of the team during this process while still trying to keep things moving quickly. Because the recruiter certainly can bring in. We can set a high filter, get a bunch of candidates in, set the filter, so that that first bit is quick, but then our internal process tends to take a lot longer because we do a bunch of a bunch of video interviews on site, reference calls and so on, and a lot of that kind of internal discussion seems to take longer. Any tips on kind of speeding up those processes, like being more efficient?
Yeah. Um, I prefer that the first two calls are with me. And I only
Mm,
send people to the rest of the team if I'm kind of sold. Sometimes I'm sold after the initial call and I still do the second call, but I'm like, okay, this is, you can just tell this is going to be a great candidate. Uh,
mm. This is specific to executive candidates, right? For you,
yeah.
and otherwise, it's the hiring manager doing those first two. It's kind of what you're suggesting. Is that right?
Yeah. I think the hiring manager should do the first two. Sometimes you're already sold in the first call and you'll have the second call because it's good diligence, but you can kind of tell that you're not gonna decline them in the second call. So then you can start doing the team in parallel with your second call. Um,
Mm-hmm.
I think it's really important that you, before you start interviewing anyone, before there's any candidates, like when you open the role, you set the expectation with the team who will be on the interview panel. And typically not everyone typically wants to be on it. Like, right? We all want more um, say in who comes into the organization next. It's a very logical
Sure.
thing, but this is where it's really important that you're strict as a CEO and kind of um, you set guidelines there. Um,
Mm. What's a good number? Because from like Google has their Project Oxygen and they have data on like, okay, after 4 or 5 interviews or something, like the signal, the marginal benefit and signal decreases or something. But like, do you have from your experience, sort of what's the right number, or how do you judge the right
four,
number?
four, five sounds great. Yeah, including the hiring manager, and then so three or four
25.
people.
Hmm, hmm. Okay. Yeah, it makes sense. One thing I found to be really high signal is also references, especially for executives, like doing a bunch of references, but like that tends to be tough to elicit early in the process. How do you sort of like get that from the candidate as early as possible? Or do you lean on references as well a lot?
Super hard to get them early, uh, especially like current employer, right? They're like
Yeah.
typically
Yeah.
no way. Um, sometimes they're open to an early reference with an old employer. Um, I would try, maybe you don't have to do every single last interview, but I do want to get kind of at least somewhat aligned on compensation. I think it's kind of
Mhm.
you want to have some buy-in there already. Like, okay, we're close enough. And then can you leave this final compensation? You can even leave after references. You
Yeah,
have
that's a
kind of
good one.
the front door references that the candidate provides, and you have the backdoor references. It's good practice to at least let the person know, like, hey, we're now start our backdoor references of people
Mhm.
you seek out. Um, yeah, the references are at least as important as the interviews. Basically, the
I
interviews are
agree.
are, are warm up to the real meat of the situation.
Yeah.
Um, there's a couple of great articles on how to conduct good reference calls. Super important.
Mhm.
Really important to realize that the front door ones have more allegiance to the candidate than to you. So that's why it's important to do backdoor references, where typically these people, you have a relationship with them, and you're more likely to learn more. References are not to learn that there's nothing wrong with someone, well, nothing wrong, but there's no weak
Mhm.
spots.
No
One
weaknesses.
has
Yeah.
weak spots. Oh, good. You want to make sure you kind of understood the weak spots already during interviewing, um, that they're not so severe that it's a no-go. You want to kind of, you don't, if it's all over the map and you kind of keep learning new, like strange, weak new things, or it's super severe, then that's a no. But
Mhm.
if you do referencing well, you'll learn the weak spots of the candidate. So don't be surprised if you learn weak spots.
Mhm. Yeah.
The I talked about we were talking about how to speed it up. I talked about the weekly interviews or the weekly reviews with the recruiter.
Hmm.
Super important to keep it going. Also, if your team does interviews, immediately after kind of the last interview concludes, plan a group call so you can discuss live. I find that people say more useful things in a call than they do when they do their written feedback. Um,
For sure.
make it required to post your notes within 12 hours after the interview. Um, there's always kind of a back and forth between panel interviews or not. Panels like 2 on 1.
Hmm.
I find it's higher signal, um, speed things up, save some
Interesting.
interviews. It's
Yeah.
less good of a candidate experience. So make sure that the interviewers understand it has to be a good interview experience too, and they have to start with the questions of the candidate. I always love to
Yeah.
start with questions of the candidate. You learn a lot about what you should focus on the rest of the interview, and like it's useful for them to understand the organization before they answer questions.
Hmm. Yeah, totally.
Of course, when you have like 3, 4 people that are interviewing on site, even like make it do them consecutively, right, on the same part of the day.
Yep.
Um, could also have a rule like if they can't make it or they're sick or they're out or they're traveling, great, then they just don't get to provide input on this candidate, um,
Hmm.
to keep speeding things along.
Hmm. Hmm.
When you're
How much is it? Oh, sorry. Go on.
when you get closer to the end, I like to say, okay, we're getting close. We have like 2, 3 candidates we're very excited about. We're kind of in the later stages. Start planning back. Say, hey, if we want this to be the start date, and this has to be the hiring date, and this is to be, and they need time to review the contract, and they can't do that during the weekend because the lawyer won't be there, and I start planning back,
Mm,
and that kind of typically gives a sense of urgency when everybody realize how many steps there's still left, and take into account the notice period the candidate wants to have and everything else.
yeah, that's a really good point. Yeah, working backward from the start date. Mm. To kind of look at it more broadly, do you see how do you balance like breadth first versus like kind of depth first? Like how many candidates do you kind of expect to see and get to the final stage before you make a decision? Because I guess the context is like sometimes we run to a sort of early on in the process, we may see a candidate that seems really good, feels really good, right? But then we don't feel like we've sampled kind of the much of the kind of pool yet, so we may delay things, and that'll drag it on. Like how much do you just pull the trigger because you trust your instincts or trust your advisors or whatever it is.
Yeah, I wouldn't hesitate to pull the trigger, but you keep the speed up in the whole recruiting process until you have a signed contract. Until that time, you just keep interviewing. You keep talking about the pipeline. Like you don't let up because you're like, oh, looks kind of close. So
Yeah,
you keep
that's
the
true.
engine going because it otherwise you have this lull and it takes a while to start it back up.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That
And
makes
then
sense.
typically you try to get 2 or 3 people to the later stages. If you don't, when a candidate for one reason opts out or you opt out, or then you have nothing. Also, it's a much better negotiation position for the company.
100%.
Like you're
Yeah,
if you have to hire this person, you're negotiating different than if you have 2 qualified people.
it's for sure. Yeah. How often are you at that stage where you kind of you have a clear bet now and you're negotiating with two people at once? Obviously, you want to be transparent. You don't
It's
want to
it's
be doing
it's
that
it's
secretly, right?
frankly, it's never happened to me. But it's really important to bring as many people to there as you
Excellent.
can,
Yeah.
and then it rarely happens where you're really where you're almost putting in. Hey, you don't put 2 offer letters out, but it rarely happens. Something
Hmm.
happens beforehand. But I think you always we're entrepreneurs. We're optimistic people, and
Yeah.
a lot can
I
happen.
will close them, right? Like, I'm gonna
Yeah,
close the
you're
deal.
just excited
Like,
about someone, and you forget to bring a few others along, and now
yeah,
you're set back with 2 months
yeah,
instead. While you could have been set back by 2 weeks.
that's right. Yeah. I think that's definitely a challenge that we run into. And I was thinking recently, like, would it make sense to sort of openly start discussing, the offer, the title, the role with a couple candidates at once, right? Even if you're not putting the offer out there, but you are getting it kind of closer than the traditional sort of like pre-offer stage.
Yeah,
You
no,
know?
get them closer and
Yeah,
closer.
get
As long
close.
as
Yeah.
you can discuss the outlines of an offer, you have to be, you can be frank about like, oh, we're still talking to another candidate that's really late stage. Oh,
Yeah.
all fair. If
Yeah.
it'd be a bad signal if they're upset about that. Obviously, you don't send out two offer letters,
Yes,
but
exactly.
other than that, I think it's very fair.
Okay. Well, cool. I mean, there's a lot of good stuff there. I think what I heard is for the things that are particularly salient for me, I think out of what you said, one is like the references and try like it is reasonable and fair to like ask for at least one kind of earlier reference early in the process. I think that would be very helpful for me.
Oh,
Um,
I've not done that typically. So I think it's fair
yeah,
to ask, but don't expect most people will
yeah,
protect their references until they're done with most of the interviews and have basic
yeah,
outline of comp. And I think that makes sense. I'd do the same thing if I was a candidate.
yeah, yeah. Fair enough. Okay.
But a good recruiter will kind of know how they, under what circumstances they left their last three jobs.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, and then the other thing I think is just like planning backward from the start date is a good way to create urgency for everyone.
Yep.
Okay, cool. Any other comments on that?
No, if the candidate is kind of delaying meetings and stuff like that, it's a very significant negative signal.
Yeah, yeah, that's a good call
Cool.
for sure.
Thanks.